Hello and welcome to this Python tutorial about functions. Functions in any programming language are the first step towards code reuse, and code reuse is really just a way of putting code in one place and being able to call it and run it over and over again without having to rewrite it each time. So we start by defining a function with the keyword def, followed by the name of the function and brackets. I'll just call it f. And we'll follow this with a colon and press enter. As you can see, the interpreter has now added two spaces to say that we are now within the scope of our function. And the scope of a function is what it sounds like, is you're within the scope of something, so you're within the function itself. Print the truth shall set you free. And now when we call f, as expected, we get the truth shall set you free. Let's define another function. Call it g. Print ignorance is bliss. Call g, and as expected, the ignorance is bliss. Let's define a third function now. Call it h. And from h we shall invoke f and g. And now when we run h, as expected, the truth shall set you free and ignorance is bliss. So this is it for the very basic concept of functions. So we can now look into adding arguments to our functions. So let's have another function. Call it I, and we'll add an argument called arg. Print the truth shall, let's say, the truth, followed by a comma and arg. Comma is simply going to add a space and then print whatever the argument is. So now when I call I can say the truth, there we go, is bliss. So when I run this, as expected, Python should print the truth is bliss. There we go. Now let's look at adding a default argument. Now what will happen? If I call I without specifying the value of the argument itself, then the interpreter will simply use whatever value is there by default, meaning ignorance, and go ahead and use this value for wherever the variable is used within the scope of that function. So if I call I, the truth is ignorance. However, if I provide an argument, then the truth is bliss. A caveat when it comes to using arguments is, let's say I have function j with two arguments. Let's call the first one arg1 and the second one arg2. I can only have default arguments towards the end of the function. So arg2 can be is bliss, arg1 can be the truth. We can now print arg1 and arg2. So if we call j, we'll get the truth is bliss. What we can also do is define a function j with the first argument not possessing a default value and the second argument possessing a default value. This time, we cannot call j without providing the value of the first argument. If we do this, then the interpreter will throw an error and say, please provide at least one argument. So once again, if I invoke it with the truth, it will say the truth is bliss. Or I can provide two arguments. The truth is ignorance, and we now have the truth is ignorance. What I cannot do, however, is this. And this is simply because if we provide an argument with a function which has been defined with a default argument which is not at the end of the argument definitions, then the interpreter will simply not know how many arguments to call or which arguments should get assigned the values which you're passing. And just to make this really clear, if we were to add a third argument here, once again, this would simply not work. However, we could add an argument here which has a default value, and we could once again remove this one. This would absolutely work because the default arguments are at the end. However, we could not have default arguments at the front of the function and then have non-default arguments at the end. Another thing about functions is that we can, and this is a Python feature, not every programming language has this, we can name our functions, our arguments rather. So the first argument could be called ignorance, and we now have ignorance is bliss. Or we could name our second function and we now have the truth is ignorance. Or we could name both, and not necessarily in the correct order. Oh, pardon me, arg1, and we now have the truth is ignorance. One last final thing about functions is that they can return a value. For example, we can have a function k which takes in a default argument, and we could just return the argument itself. So now if we call k, it's actually returning the string, the truth. Or in fact, it will return whatever we pass as an argument. So for example, we could do this, which would first run the function which is in the inside the brackets for this function here, return its value, and then pass that value as the argument of k once again, which will return that value again. So I'm expecting this to just return ignorance. And here we have it, ignorance. So this pretty much covers the basics of functions in Python, and I'll see you in our next tutorial. Thank you very much.